The most dangerous mistake a person can make is assuming they know who is standing in front of them. The laughter started at table 12. Not loud enough to stop the restaurant. Not loud enough to make headlines. But loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Grace Parker stood beside the table holding a coffee pot in one hand and a small order pad in the other. The lunch crowd filled the upscale restaurant with conversation, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of business meetings. Outside, autumn sunlight reflected against the glass walls of downtown Hartford. Inside, Grace remained calm. She had learned long ago that silence was often stronger than argument. Across the table sat Victoria Walker. Elegant, wealthy, perfectly dressed. The kind of woman who carried confidence like jewelry. Beside her sat several guests from a charity committee. They smiled politely at everything she said. Most people did. Victoria lifted a menu and glanced at Grace. "Could you explain this item?" she asked. Grace leaned forward slightly. "Of course." Before she could finish, Victoria laughed and looked at the others. "Actually, never mind." Several heads turned. Victoria smiled. She probably cannot even read the menu herself. A few people chuckled. One woman covered her mouth. Another looked uncomfortable. The laughter lasted only seconds. Yet the words stayed in the air much longer. Grace lowered her eyes toward the order pad. Not because she felt defeated. Because she was deciding whether the comment deserved a response. It did not. "Would you like a few more minutes?" she asked politely. Victoria looked almost disappointed, as if she had expected an argument. "That will be all." Grace nodded and walked away. Behind her, the conversation resumed. The restaurant moved on. Most people forgot the moment immediately. Grace did not. Neither did a young boy sitting 3 tables away. Noah Walker had heard every word. 8 years old. Curious. Observant. He looked from Victoria to Grace and frowned. Something about the exchange felt wrong. Children often recognized unfairness faster than adults. Across the room, Noah's father stood near the entrance, speaking on his phone. Ethan. Walker rarely had a free moment. Billion-dollar deals followed him everywhere. Today was no different. He paced slowly beside the window, focused on a conversation with investors in New York. He never heard what his wife had said. Grace stepped behind the service counter and placed the coffee pot down. Her face revealed nothing. No anger. No embarrassment. No resentment. Just quiet composure. Then her attention shifted. Victoria had removed several documents from an expensive leather folder. Financial reports. Contracts. Donation records. The papers spread across the table while the charity committee discussed an upcoming fundraising event. Grace glanced at them only briefly. 1 second. Maybe 2. Yet something immediately caught her attention. A company name. A familiar signature. A detail she had not seen in years. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not enough for anyone to notice. Not enough to draw attention. But enough to awaken a memory. Victoria continued speaking confidently while pointing to figures on the documents. The committee members nodded along. Grace picked up another tray and returned to work. Yet the name remained in her mind. She had seen it before. Somewhere important. Somewhere connected to a part of her life she rarely discussed. Across the restaurant, Victoria laughed again. Across the room, Noah continued watching Grace. And inside the pocket of Grace's apron, her hand rested quietly against a pen as a single thought echoed through her mind. The woman who had just called her illiterate had no idea who she really was. Grace spent the rest of the afternoon exactly as she always did. She delivered meals, refilled coffee cups, smiled politely when customers thanked her. To everyone around her, she looked like an ordinary waitress finishing an ordinary shift. Yet behind her calm expression, a memory had already begun unfolding. The company name on Victoria's documents refused to leave her mind. She had seen it years ago. Not once. Many times. Back when her days looked very different. Back when her desk was covered with spreadsheets instead of menus. Back when people came to her for answers instead of coffee. The lunch crowd gradually thinned. Sunlight shifted across the hardwood floor. At table 12, Victoria continued discussing fundraising plans with the committee members. Every now and then she glanced toward Grace. Sometimes with amusement. Sometimes with the satisfaction of someone convinced she had established her place above another person. Grace ignored it. Experience had taught her something important. Arrogance usually revealed more about the speaker than the target. Across the dining room, Noah quietly finished a grilled cheese sandwich. He kept looking toward Grace whenever his father was distracted. Finally, he slid out of his chair and approached the service station where she was organizing receipts. Miss Grace. Grace looked up and smiled. Yes. Noah hesitated. I do not think what she said was nice. Grace immediately knew who he meant. Sometimes people say things they should not. Noah frowned. Did it make you sad? Grace considered the question carefully. Children deserved honest answers. A little. Noah nodded. It made me sad too. Grace felt something soften inside her. Thank you for telling me. Before Noah could say anything else, Ethan ended his call and noticed his son speaking with a staff member. He walked over. Everything okay? Noah looked up. We were talking. Ethan offered a polite smile. I hope he is not causing trouble. Not at all, Grace said. For a brief moment their eyes met. Ethan noticed something he had missed earlier. Confidence. Not loud confidence. Quiet confidence. The kind that did not need attention. Noah, Ethan said gently. We should get going. Noah sighed dramatically. Okay. As father and son prepared to leave, Victoria finally stood from the table. Her committee meeting was ending as well. She gathered her documents and slipped them back into the leather folder. For a split second, one page slid free and drifted toward the floor. Grace instinctively stepped forward and caught it before it landed. Her eyes scanned the page for less than a second before handing it back. But that second was enough. Numbers. Signatures. Donation transfers. A familiar accounting structure. Victoria accepted the page without realizing what Grace had seen. Thank you, she said, though her tone lacked warmth. Then she turned and walked away. Minutes later, the restaurant was quiet again. Grace stood alone near the counter, holding a cold cup of coffee she had forgotten to finish. Outside, the Walker family disappeared into a waiting black SUV. Inside, Grace stared through the window. The memory was finally clear now. She knew exactly where she had seen that company before. And more importantly, she knew why it mattered. The realization sent a chill through her chest. Because if she was right, the woman who mocked her that afternoon was hiding far more than an ugly attitude. That night, rain tapped softly against the windows of Grace Parker's small apartment. The city lights outside blurred into streaks of gold and white across the glass. Most people would have spent the evening watching television or scrolling through their phones. Grace sat at a modest kitchen table with a laptop open in front of her and a notebook filled with handwritten notes beside it. A cold cup of tea rested untouched near her elbow. She had not changed out of her diner uniform yet. Her apron hung over the back of a chair. The company name from Victoria's document glowed on the screen. Grace stared at it quietly. Years ago, seeing that name would have been normal. Back then she worked in a very different world. A world of audits, financial statements, and endless rows of numbers. Most people found numbers boring. Grace never had. Numbers told stories. More importantly, they revealed lies. She opened a public records database and entered the company name. Seconds later, several filings appeared. Nothing unusual at first glance. Charitable organizations. Donations. Community projects. The kind of records nobody questioned. Yet something felt familiar. Something about the structure. Something about the way funds moved between entities. Grace leaned back slowly. Her memory was sharp. She had spent years examining financial reports where small details mattered. A missing decimal. An unusual transfer. A repeated signature. Tiny clues often led to larger truths. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from her friend Olivia appeared. Still. Working? Grace smiled faintly and typed back. Just thinking. Olivia responded almost immediately. That usually means trouble. Grace glanced at the screen and shook her head. Maybe. After ending the conversation, she returned to the records. Another filing caught her attention. Then another. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Not proof. Not yet. Just enough inconsistency to make her curious. Across town, Ethan Walker sat alone in his home office. The mansion was quiet. Noah had already gone to bed. Rain tapped against the tall windows overlooking the property. Ethan loosened his tie and reviewed emails that had accumulated throughout the day. Yet his mind kept drifting elsewhere. Back to the restaurant. Back to the conversation between Noah and Grace. Back to the expression on Grace's face when she remained silent after being insulted. Most people would have argued, defended themselves, demanded respect. Grace had done none of those things. Ethan found himself wondering why. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Victoria stepped into the office carrying a glass of sparkling water. You are still working? She asked. Ethan smiled tiredly. Always. She laughed and sat across from him. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Yet Ethan noticed something unusual. Victoria's leather folder sat tucked beneath her arm. The same folder she had carried earlier that day. Big fundraiser coming up, he asked. Victoria nodded quickly. A lot of details. Ethan accepted the answer without further questions. But something about her response felt rushed. Across the city, Grace finally closed her laptop after midnight. She had not discovered anything conclusive. Only questions. More questions than answers. Yet one fact remained impossible to ignore. The company connected to Victoria's documents appeared repeatedly in records that should not have been connected at all. Grace stood and walked toward the window. Rain continued falling over Hartford. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the Walker family slept peacefully. Grace looked down at the notebook in her hands. Then she quietly wrote a single sentence beneath the company name. Follow the money. The moment the pen left the page, she had a feeling her life was about to become far more complicated. The next morning arrived clear and bright. The rain had disappeared, leaving Hartford washed clean beneath a pale blue sky. Grace arrived at the restaurant before sunrise, as she always did. The streets were quiet. Delivery trucks unloaded supplies. Streetlights flickered off one by one. Inside, the restaurant still smelled faintly of fresh bread and coffee beans. For a few peaceful minutes, the world felt simple again. Grace tied on her apron and began preparing for the breakfast rush. Yet her notebook remained tucked inside her bag beneath the counter. Every time she thought about the company records from the night before, the same uneasy feeling returned. The numbers did not make sense, and numbers rarely lied. By 9 o'clock, the restaurant was busy. Business executives discussed meetings over coffee. Tourists studied city maps. Servers moved quickly between tables. Then the front doors opened. Ethan Walker entered first. Noah followed close behind carrying a backpack and a sketchbook. A few seconds later, Victoria appeared. Grace noticed them immediately, not because they were wealthy, because they had become impossible to ignore. Noah spotted her first. His face brightened. Miss Grace. Grace smiled. Good morning. Noah hurried over before his parents could stop him. I got an A on my science project. Congratulations. Noah proudly showed her a paper covered with stickers and teacher comments. Grace studied it carefully. Looks like you earned it. Noah grinned. Ethan watched the interaction from nearby. Again, he noticed the same thing. Grace never spoke to Noah differently because of who his father was. She treated him like a child, not a billionaire's son. Victoria seemed less amused. Noah, she said sharply. Let her work. Noah returned to the table without arguing. Grace simply nodded and continued serving customers. 20 minutes later, Victoria's charity committee began arriving one by one. The same faces from earlier in the week. The same expensive clothing. The same leather folders and donation reports. Grace carried coffee to the table. As she placed the cups down, a familiar logo appeared again on the corner of one document. The same company. The same organization. This time she noticed something else. A transfer reference number. Small. Easy to miss. Most people would never have seen it. Grace did. Her pulse quickened slightly. Not from fear. From recognition. She knew exactly what those numbers represented. Years ago, she had reviewed hundreds of financial reports using the same format. The reference number indicated that money had passed through multiple organizations before reaching its final destination. That was not necessarily illegal, but it often raised questions. Grace returned to the service station and wrote the number on a napkin before she could forget it. Across the room, Ethan happened to glance in her direction. He noticed the concentration on her face. The focus. The quiet intensity. It looked completely out of place on someone supposedly unable to read a menu. A strange thought crossed his mind. What if he had misjudged her? The idea stayed with him for the rest of the morning. Meanwhile, Victoria laughed confidently as she discussed donations and public recognition. The committee members listened carefully. Nobody questioned her. Nobody challenged her. Nobody saw what Grace had begun to see. But piece by piece, the picture was changing. And somewhere beneath the surface of a routine breakfast meeting, the first real cracks were beginning to appear. That evening, Grace returned home carrying more questions than answers. The small apartment felt quieter than usual. She placed her keys on the kitchen counter, set her bag beside a chair, and immediately opened her laptop. Outside, the last traces of sunlight faded behind the Hartford skyline. Inside, The glow from the screen illuminated pages of records she had spent years learning how to understand. The transfer reference number from Victoria's document sat at the top of her notebook. Grace entered it into several public databases. Most searches returned nothing useful. Dead ends, archived reports, routine filings. Then, nearly an hour later, a result appeared. Grace sat forward. The reference number was linked to a charitable grant issued 3 years earlier. That alone meant nothing. Large organizations processed thousands of grants every year. But when she followed the transaction trail, something unusual appeared. The money had passed through multiple nonprofit entities before arriving at its final destination. Again, not necessarily improper. Yet the pattern repeated itself several times. Different charities, different projects, the same route, the same organizations, the same company name appearing quietly in the background. Grace stared at the screen. Her instincts stirred, not because she had discovered wrongdoing. She had not yet, but because the structure looked familiar. Too familiar. Across town, Ethan sat at the kitchen table helping Noah finish homework. The mansion was peaceful, the kind of peace successful people often spent their entire lives trying to buy. Yet Ethan found himself distracted. Noah noticed immediately. "You are thinking about something." Ethan smiled. "Am I that obvious?" Noah nodded. "You keep staring at your coffee." Ethan looked down. The coffee had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. "Maybe I am thinking." Noah considered this carefully. "About Miss Grace?" Ethan almost laughed. "Why would you think that?" "Because every time Mom talks about her, you get quiet." Ethan did not answer right away. Children often notice things adults missed. "I think she is interesting," he finally admitted. Noah smiled. "I knew it." Meanwhile, several miles away, Grace continued following the numbers. Midnight came and went. The city grew still. One by one, apartment windows across the street went dark. Then another name appeared on her screen. A board member. Then another. Suddenly Grace recognized one of them. Years ago, during her career as a forensic accountant, she had reviewed a report involving that individual. Nothing criminal. Nothing dramatic. Just a financial review that had raised concerns before being quietly resolved. Grace leaned back slowly. The pieces were not fitting together yet, but they were getting closer. Very slowly, a larger picture was beginning to emerge. The next morning, she arrived at the restaurant carrying her notebook inside her bag. She intended to focus on work. Nothing more. Yet the moment she stepped through the doors, she saw Victoria already seated at a corner table speaking with 2 men in expensive suits. One of them placed a folder on the table. The same company logo was stamped across the cover. Grace stopped walking for half a second, then continued as though she had noticed nothing. But deep inside, one realization had become impossible to ignore. Whatever secret connected those documents, it was much bigger than a single charity meeting. And for the first time, Grace began to suspect that discovering the truth might affect far more than Victoria Walker alone. The morning unfolded more slowly than Grace expected. Victoria remained at the corner table with the 2 businessmen for nearly an hour. They spoke quietly, occasionally reviewing documents inside the folder with the familiar company logo. Grace moved throughout the restaurant carrying trays and refilling coffee cups, yet part of her attention remained fixed on that table. Not because she was looking for secrets, because her professional instincts refused to let go. Years earlier, those instincts had helped her identify inconsistencies hidden inside reports worth millions of dollars. Once trained, a mind never completely forgets. Shortly before noon, one of the businessmen left behind a folded document while stepping away to answer a call. It remained on the table for less than 30 seconds. Most people would never have noticed it. Grace did. As she approached with fresh coffee, her eyes briefly caught a heading near the top of the page. Foundation Asset Allocation Summary. Her pulse quickened. Asset allocation reports were not unusual, yet they rarely appeared during routine charity planning meetings. She continued walking without changing expression. Victoria noticed nothing. Neither did the businessmen. Across the room, Noah sat working on a school assignment while waiting for his father to finish a meeting nearby. Every few minutes, he glanced toward Grace. The friendship between them had become natural, simple, unforced. Ethan arrived shortly after noon and joined his son. Unlike previous visits, he seemed distracted, thoughtful. His attention repeatedly drifted toward Grace. Eventually, Noah noticed. "You are doing it again." Ethan looked up. "Doing what?" "Thinking." Ethan laughed softly. Apparently I have a habit. Noah pointed toward Grace. It is about her. Ethan smiled despite himself. Maybe. The answer surprised him. Because it was true. The more he observed Grace, the less she matched the image Victoria had painted. Illiterate. Uneducated. Ordinary. None of those descriptions fit. Grace carried herself differently. She listened differently. She noticed details other people ignored. Something about her suggested a life larger than the one she currently lived. Meanwhile, Grace finally received the break she needed. Victoria and the businessmen gathered their belongings and left together. As they stood, one small piece of paper slipped unnoticed beneath the table. The group exited without realizing it. Grace waited several minutes before approaching. Then she bent down and retrieved the paper. A receipt. Nothing more. Yet one number immediately caught her attention. It matched one of the transaction references from her notebook. Grace stared at it for several seconds. The receipt connected directly to the organization she had been researching. Coincidence remained possible, but the odds were shrinking. Later that evening, after the restaurant closed, Grace sat once again at her kitchen table. This time she entered the new reference number into her database search. The result appeared almost instantly. She froze. The transaction connected 3 separate nonprofit organizations to a single financial management account. Grace leaned closer to the screen. The account administrator's name appeared at the bottom of the record. She recognized it immediately, not because it belonged to Victoria, because it belonged to someone even more surprising. Ethan Walker. Grace sat back slowly. The room fell silent. Suddenly the situation looked very different. If the records were accurate, Ethan's name appeared throughout the same financial network she had been tracing for days. Whether he knew it or not, he was connected to whatever story the numbers were trying to tell. And for the first time, Grace realized. The truth might have the power to change far more than a charity fundraiser. It might change an entire family. Grace barely slept that night. The discovery continued circling through her mind long after she closed the laptop. Ethan Walker's name appeared repeatedly throughout the financial records. Not once, not twice, multiple times. Yet something about it felt wrong. During her years as a forensic accountant, she had learned one important lesson. Names on documents did not always tell the full story. Sometimes they identified decision-makers. Sometimes they identified sponsors. Sometimes they belonged to people who had no idea how their names were being used. Assumptions destroyed investigations. Facts solved them. The next morning arrived cold and bright. A sharp autumn breeze swept through Hartford as Grace walked to work carrying a coffee in one hand and her notebook in the other. Fallen leaves drifted across sidewalks. Commuters hurried toward office buildings. Everything looked normal. Yet Grace felt the weight of unanswered questions. Inside the restaurant, the breakfast crowd arrived early. The familiar rhythm of work helped clear her thoughts. Orders, coffee, smiles, receipts. For several hours, she focused entirely on customers. Then shortly before noon, Ethan and Noah walked through the front doors. Noah immediately spotted her. Miss Grace. Grace smiled. Good afternoon. Noah hurried over carrying a school notebook. I got another assignment. Already. Noah nodded proudly. My teacher says I asked too many questions. Grace laughed softly. That sounds like a useful skill. Ethan heard the exchange and smiled. Believe me, he inherited that from me. For a brief moment, the three of them shared an easy conversation. Nothing complicated. Nothing important. Yet as Grace listened to Ethan speak with his son, another thought surfaced. He genuinely cared about Noah. The warmth felt real. The patience felt real. The kindness felt real. It did not fit the image of a man secretly manipulating charitable funds. Again, her instincts resisted the conclusion the documents seemed to suggest. Later that afternoon, the restaurant became unexpectedly quiet. Ethan remained behind after Noah left for an after-school activity. He sat alone near the window reviewing emails on a tablet. Grace brought fresh coffee. Long day, she asked. Ethan looked up. Most of them are. Grace nodded. That is usually a sign you are doing too much. Ethan laughed softly. You sound like my assistant. Maybe your assistant is right. The answer surprised him. Not because of what she said, because of how naturally she said it. He studied her for a moment. Can I ask you something? Grace already suspected the question. You can. Ethan leaned back. You do not seem like someone who has always worked in restaurants. Grace paused. Outside, a gust of wind scattered leaves across the sidewalk. I have had other jobs. What kind? For several seconds, she considered avoiding the answer. Then she decided otherwise. Forensic accounting. Ethan blinked. You are serious? Grace nodded. Very. Silence settled between them. Ethan stared at her. Suddenly dozens of small moments made sense. The way she noticed details. The way she listened. The confidence hidden beneath her quiet demeanor. Then why are you working here? Grace looked down at the coffee pot in her hand. Because sometimes life takes you somewhere different than you planned. Ethan did not press further. Yet the conversation stayed with him long after she walked away. And for Grace, something else remained. The more she learned about Ethan Walker, the harder it became to believe he was the person she should be worried about. Which meant someone else might be hiding behind the numbers. That evening, Grace reopened every document she had collected during the past week. Receipts, public filings, board member lists, donation records. The dining table in her apartment slowly disappeared beneath stacks of notes and printed pages. Outside, wind rattled the windows while autumn rain returned to Hartford. Inside, only the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated the room. Grace read everything again from the beginning. That had always been her method. When the answer refused to appear, start over. Follow every detail. Trust the facts. By midnight, a pattern emerged that she had somehow overlooked before. Ethan's name appeared repeatedly, but always in the same capacity. Sponsor, benefactor, donor, never administrator, never approver, never controller. The distinction mattered. A lot. Grace sat forward. For days she had been focusing on who appeared in the records. Now she started focusing on who signed them. One signature appeared again and again. Not Ethan's. Victoria's. The realization sent a chill through her. She quickly opened another file. Then another. The same result. Ethan provided funding. Victoria authorized distribution. Ethan's name created trust. Victoria controlled movement. Grace stared at the screen in silence. For the first time, the pieces aligned. The next morning she arrived at the restaurant carrying a heavier burden than before. Not because she had discovered proof of wrongdoing. She had not. But because the questions now pointed in a very specific direction. Around noon, the Walker family arrived again. Noah immediately rushed over to show Grace a drawing he had completed at school. This time it was a sketch of the restaurant. Every table was drawn. Every window. Every customer. Grace smiled as she examined it. You notice a lot of details. Noah looked proud. My teacher says that too. Ethan overheard the conversation and laughed. Looks like he inherited it from someone. Grace glanced at him. Maybe. The exchange felt warm. Natural. Yet Victoria appeared distracted. She checked her phone repeatedly throughout lunch. Her smile came slower than usual. Her responses shorter. Several times Grace noticed her stepping away from the table to answer calls in private. Something had changed. Later that afternoon, after Noah left for a school activity, Ethan remained behind to finish a business meeting. Victoria excused herself again and walked outside. Through the restaurant windows, Grace watched her speaking urgently into her phone near the curb. The expression on Victoria's face was impossible to miss. Concern, frustration, worry. It lasted only a minute before she composed herself and returned inside. Most people would never have noticed. Grace did. Ethan did not. He remained focused on a conference call. As Victoria passed the service station, a folded piece of paper slipped from her purse and landed near the counter. Grace picked it up immediately. She intended to return it without looking. Then a familiar company logo caught her eye. For a brief second, she saw a meeting date printed beneath it. Saturday evening. Walker Foundation Annual Gala. Grace handed the paper back without comment. Victoria thanked her quickly and walked away. But the date remained in Grace's mind. The annual gala was only 4 days away. The largest fundraising event of the year. Hundreds of donors, community leaders, journalists, board members. Everyone important would be there. As Grace returned to work, a quiet realization settled over her. Whatever truth had been hiding inside those records, it was connected to that event. And somehow, she felt certain the answers she had been searching for were about to come into the open. The 4 days leading up to the gala passed faster than Grace expected. Every evening, she returned to her apartment and continued reviewing records. Every morning, she arrived at the restaurant carrying the same notebook filled with dates, names, and transaction references. The deeper she looked, the clearer the picture became. Yet one problem remained. She still lacked the final piece. Suspicion was not enough. Experience had taught her that assumptions could destroy innocent lives just as easily as they could expose dishonesty. She needed facts. Real facts. On Thursday afternoon, the restaurant was unusually quiet. A light rain drifted across Hartford, leaving the streets slick and reflective beneath gray skies. Grace was organizing receipts near the service station when Ethan walked in alone. No business partners. No committee members. No Victoria. Just Ethan carrying a laptop bag and looking more tired than usual. He settled into his usual table near the window. Grace brought coffee without being asked. "Rough week?" she asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "You could say that." Grace noticed the fatigue around his eyes. "The gala?" Ethan nodded. "The gala. The foundation. A dozen other things." He stared out the window for a moment. "Sometimes I feel like I spend more time signing papers than actually helping people." The comment caught Grace's attention immediately. "Signing papers?" Ethan shrugged. "Donation approvals. Foundation reports. Event authorizations. Victoria handles most of it." Grace remained silent. Ethan continued. "Honestly, I trust her with the details." The sentence lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Grace suddenly understood why Ethan's name appeared throughout the records. He signed what was placed in front of him. He funded projects. He trusted the people managing them. The realization made her uneasy. Not because it proved anything, because it explained everything. Later that evening, after Ethan left, Noah appeared unexpectedly with a driver. The boy carried a sketchbook tucked beneath one arm. "Miss Grace," he said excitedly, "I want to show you something." Grace smiled. "What is it?" Noah opened the sketchbook. Inside were drawings from the charity events he had attended with his parents over the years. Banquets, fundraisers, community centers. Grace turned several pages until one image made her pause. It showed Victoria standing beside a group of foundation executives. A date was written beneath the drawing. 2 years earlier. Grace's eyes moved to one of the names Noah had carefully labeled beside the figures. Her heart skipped. The man in the drawing was the same administrator whose name appeared throughout the financial records. "Who is this?" she asked carefully. Noah pointed. "Mr. Collins. Mom works with him all the time." Grace kept her expression neutral. "Do you see him often?" Noah nodded. "More than Dad does." The answer landed heavily. That night, Grace returned home and searched for every connection between Victoria and Richard Collins. This time she found it. Board memberships, shared projects, repeated authorizations. The same two names appearing together again and again. Then finally, buried inside an archived filing, she discovered the detail she had been missing. A financial disclosure form. Small, forgotten, overlooked by almost everyone. Grace stared at the screen in complete silence. There it was. The connection that explained everything. The proof she had been searching for. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, Grace slowly closed her laptop. The gala was now less than 48 hours away. And for the first time since this began, she knew exactly what truth had been hiding behind Victoria's smile. Friday arrived with clear skies and sharp autumn sunlight pouring across Hartford. The city seemed brighter than it had all week. Yet Grace felt none of that brightness. The financial disclosure form she had discovered the night before remained open on her laptop screen long after sunrise. She had reviewed it 6 times already. Every detail pointed to the same conclusion. Richard Collins was not merely a foundation administrator. He held a private financial interest connected to organizations receiving charitable funds. More importantly, Victoria Walker had repeatedly approved transfers involving those same organizations without disclosing the relationship. The issue was not that money had disappeared. Grace had found no evidence of theft. The problem was transparency. Donors believed decisions were being made independently. The records suggested otherwise. Grace closed the laptop and sat quietly for several minutes. Years ago, she would have immediately submitted a report. That had been her job, her responsibility. But now things felt different. Ethan's name was attached to the foundation. Noah's future was tied to the family's reputation. One careless accusation could damage innocent people. She needed certainty. That afternoon, the restaurant buzzed with unusual excitement. Several customers discussed the upcoming Walker Foundation Gala. It was one of the most anticipated charity events of the year. Community leaders, business executives, journalists, and donors would all attend. Grace listened without joining the conversation. Every mention of the gala increased the weight on her shoulders. Shortly after lunch, Ethan arrived. Alone again. He seemed exhausted. More exhausted than she had ever seen him. Grace placed a coffee in front of him before he asked. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You look tired." Ethan smiled faintly. "That obvious?" "A little." He glanced out the window. "Sometimes I wonder if the foundation is helping people as much as everyone believes." Grace froze. Ethan continued speaking before she could respond. "The mission matters. The projects matter. But lately things feel different." Grace studied him carefully. "Different how?" Ethan hesitated. "I do not know." He rubbed his forehead. "Maybe I have just been too busy." Yet Grace could tell he was not convinced by his own answer. Something had already begun bothering him. He simply had not identified it yet. At that moment, Noah burst through the front doors carrying a stack of invitations. "Dad." Ethan smiled immediately. "What is all that?" Noah dropped the invitations onto the table. "Gala stuff." Grace noticed one envelope slide free. Across the front was printed the event's theme: building trust through community. The words landed with unexpected force. Trust. The entire foundation depended on trust. Donors trusted leaders. Communities trusted promises. Families trusted each other. And trust was fragile. Once broken, it rarely returned unchanged. Later that evening, Grace walked home beneath a sky filled with orange and purple light. Leaves drifted across the sidewalk around her feet. In her bag rested copies of every document she had collected. Every transfer. Every disclosure. Every connection. She stopped briefly on a bridge overlooking the river. The water below reflected the fading sunset. For several minutes, she stood in silence. Then she made a decision. She would not expose anyone based on suspicion. She would not embarrass anyone based on assumptions. But if the truth appeared clearly, she would not look away either. The gala was tomorrow night. And deep inside, Grace felt certain that whatever happened there would change the lives of everyone involved. Saturday evening arrived wrapped in golden light and anticipation. The Walker Foundation Gala occupied the grand ballroom of one of Hartford's most prestigious hotels. Crystal chandeliers illuminated polished marble floors. Elegant music drifted through the air. Hundreds of guests moved between tables decorated with white roses and silver centerpieces. Business leaders, community organizers, journalists, donors, everyone important seemed to be there. At the entrance, photographers welcomed guests while foundation volunteers guided them toward the ballroom. Ethan Walker stood near the stage greeting attendees with practiced warmth. A tailored black suit replaced his usual business attire, yet the fatigue Grace had noticed throughout the week remained visible beneath his smile. Beside him stood Victoria, flawless as always. Elegant, confident, poised. She moved through the crowd effortlessly, accepting compliments and congratulations from nearly everyone she met. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple leading a successful foundation. Noah arrived shortly afterward with a family friend assigned to help supervise him during the evening. The boy looked uncomfortable in formal clothes. He scanned the ballroom until his eyes widened. Near the back of the room, standing quietly beside a service entrance, was Grace. Unlike everyone else, she had not come as a donor or guest of honor. She wore a simple navy dress and carried a small folder beneath one arm. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. Yet Noah immediately smiled and hurried toward her. "You came." Grace returned the smile. "Looks like I did." Noah lowered his voice. "Dad is nervous." Grace glanced toward Ethan. "I think a lot of people are." As guests settled into their seats, the evening program began. Foundation achievements filled large screens positioned around the ballroom. Videos highlighted scholarships, community centers, educational grants, and outreach programs funded over the years. Applause followed each presentation. Ethan spoke briefly about service, responsibility, and trust. The audience responded warmly. Grace listened from the back of the room. Every word about trust seemed to echo louder than the rest. Then Victoria approached the stage. The crowd greeted her with enthusiastic applause. She smiled confidently and began discussing the foundation's future plans. Her voice carried easily through the ballroom. Everything appeared perfect, until one unexpected moment changed the atmosphere. During her remarks, Victoria thanked several key partners by name. One of those names was Richard Collins. The instant she spoke it, Grace felt every piece of the puzzle lock into place. Not because the name surprised her, Because of the way Victoria described him. Independent advisor. Trusted steward. Community advocate. The audience accepted the description without question. Grace knew the records told a more complicated story. As applause filled the room once again, Ethan glanced toward the audience and unexpectedly noticed Grace standing near the back wall. Their eyes met across the ballroom. For a brief moment, neither looked away. Something about her expression immediately caught his attention. She did not look impressed. She did not look angry. She looked certain. The realization unsettled him. Meanwhile, Victoria continued speaking with growing confidence. The audience remained captivated. Nobody noticed the quiet waitress standing in the shadows. Nobody realized she carried a folder containing documents capable of changing the entire evening. Yet as the final segment of the gala approached, Grace felt remarkably calm. The decision she had wrestled with all week no longer felt complicated. The truth was not about humiliation. It was not about revenge. It was not about proving someone wrong. It was about protecting trust. And before the night ended, everyone in that ballroom would finally understand the difference. The final presentation of the evening was moments away when Ethan stepped back onto the stage. The ballroom quieted immediately. Hundreds of guests turned their attention toward him. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished tables. Cameras from local media outlets remained fixed on the podium. Everything appeared perfectly planned. Yet Ethan felt an unexpected sense of unease. He glanced once more toward the back of the room. Grace was still there, calm, composed, holding the same folder beneath her arm. Something about her presence felt significant, as though she already knew how the night would end. Ethan cleared his throat and prepared to begin. Then a voice interrupted from the audience. "Mr. Walker." Several heads turned. Grace had stepped forward. The room grew noticeably quieter. Victoria's smile disappeared almost instantly. Ethan looked surprised, but not annoyed. "Yes." Grace spoke calmly. "Before the foundation closes this evening, there is information I believe deserves clarification." Murmurs spread through the audience. Victoria immediately stood. "This is neither the time nor the place." Grace met her gaze. "Actually, I believe it is exactly the right time and place." The confidence in her voice surprised everyone, including Ethan. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ethan made a decision. Let her speak. Silence followed. Grace slowly approached the stage. Every eye in the ballroom followed her. A week earlier, most of these people would have walked past her without noticing. Tonight, they watched her with complete attention. Grace reached the podium and carefully placed the folder on top. She did not rush. She did not dramatize anything. She simply opened the folder and removed several documents. Over the past week, I reviewed public financial records connected to the foundation. The room remained silent. I found no evidence that donor money disappeared. Several people exchanged confused glances. Victoria folded her arms. "Then what exactly is your point?" Grace turned one page toward the audience. "My concern is transparency." The words seemed to hang in the air. Several organizations receiving foundation funds share undisclosed financial relationships with individuals involved in approving those distributions. This time the silence deepened. Grace continued, "The issue is not theft. The issue is disclosure." She calmly presented the documents. Financial records, board memberships, public filings, disclosure statements. Everything came from publicly available sources. Nothing had been altered. Nothing had been hidden. Grace never raised her voice. She never accused anyone of criminal behavior. She simply presented facts. Then came the final document, the one she had discovered 2 nights earlier. This filing confirms that Richard Collins maintained a financial interest connected to organizations receiving approved funding while serving as an advisor. A journalist near the front immediately began taking notes. Several board members looked at one another with visible concern. Ethan stared at the documents in disbelief. He had never seen them before. Slowly, his eyes shifted toward Victoria. "Did you know about this?" The question landed heavily. Victoria hesitated, just for a second. Yet that second told everyone everything. "It was not relevant," she finally said. The answer only made the silence worse. Ethan looked back at the records, then at Grace, then at the audience. For the first time all evening, nobody seemed interested in speeches or awards. They wanted truth. Grace stepped away from the podium. Her job was finished. She had not come to destroy anyone. She had not come for revenge. She had simply brought facts into a room that desperately needed them. And as the ballroom sat in complete silence, one memory returned to Ethan with painful clarity. The woman standing quietly beside the stage was the same waitress his wife had mocked for being unable to read. Yet she was also the only person in the room who had read everything. The silence inside the ballroom lasted longer than anyone expected. No music played. No one reached for a microphone. No one seemed certain what to say next. The documents remained on the podium beneath the bright stage lights. Facts had replaced assumptions. Truth had replaced appearances. And suddenly the evening looked very different from the one everyone had expected. Ethan stood motionless for several seconds. His eyes moved from the financial records to Victoria, then back to Grace. Throughout his career, he had built companies by trusting information. Numbers mattered. Transparency mattered. Accountability mattered. Yet somehow, inside his own foundation, he had stopped asking questions. Not because he did not care, because he believed the people closest to him were already doing it. Victoria finally broke the silence. "You are making this sound much worse than it is." Her voice remained steady, but the confidence that once filled it had faded. Grace looked at her calmly. "I am not making it sound like anything. I only presented the records." The simplicity of the answer made arguing difficult. Several board members had already begun reviewing copies of the documents. Quiet. Conversations spread throughout the ballroom. Questions replaced applause. Ethan stepped toward the podium. "The foundation will conduct a full independent review of every disclosure and approval process immediately." His voice carried through the room with calm authority. "If mistakes were made, they will be corrected." The audience responded with respectful silence. It was the response of people processing disappointment while still respecting honesty. Grace felt a sense of relief. This was all she had wanted. Not humiliation. Not punishment. Accountability. Nothing more. A few moments later, Noah appeared beside her. Somehow he had slipped through the crowd without anyone noticing. "Miss Grace." Grace smiled down at him. "Hi." Noah looked toward the stage. "You were not scared." Grace thought about the question. "Actually, I was." Noah looked surprised. "Really?" Grace nodded. "Being brave does not mean you are not scared. It means you do the right thing anyway." Noah considered that carefully. Then he smiled. "That sounds smart." Across the room, Ethan overheard the conversation. For the first time all evening, he smiled as well. The gala ended earlier than planned. Guests slowly departed. Journalists gathered statements. Board members scheduled emergency meetings. The foundation would spend months reviewing policies and procedures. Yet as the ballroom gradually emptied, something unexpected happened. Ethan walked directly toward Grace. The room seemed to notice. Conversations quieted. Several people stopped to watch. Ethan stopped a few feet away. "I owe you an apology." Grace said nothing. Ethan continued. "Not just for tonight. For failing to see who you really were." The memory clearly haunted him. The restaurant. The laughter. The insult. Grace looked at him for a moment before answering. "People see what they expect to see." Ethan nodded slowly. "That is exactly the problem." For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Noah stepped between them and handed Grace a folded piece of paper. "I made this earlier." Grace opened it. Inside was a drawing. 3 figures stood together beneath a bright blue sky. One was Noah. One was Ethan. The third wore an apron. Across the top, written in uneven handwriting, were 6 simple words. "Thank you for telling the truth." Grace stared at the drawing and smiled. A real smile. The kind that reached her eyes. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the hotel entrance as guests disappeared into the night. The city continued moving forward. Life continued moving forward. And somewhere between a restaurant table and a ballroom stage, a quiet waitress had reminded an entire room of something easy to forget. Truth does not need the loudest voice. It only needs the courage to be spoken.